Good afternoon and welcome. My colleagues at the Federal Reserve and I are dedicated to serving the American people. We do this by steadfastly pursuing the goals that Congress has given us: maximum employment and stable prices. We're committed to making the best decisions we can based on facts and objective analysis. Today, we decided to lower the interest rates for the third time this year. We took this step to help keep the U.S. economy strong in the face of global developments and to provide some insurance against ongoing risks. As I will explain shortly, the policy adjustments we've made since last year are providing, and will continue to provide, meaningful support to the economy. We believe that monetary policy is in a good place. The U.S. economy is in its 11th year of expansion, and the baseline outlook remains favorable. The overall economy is growing at a moderate rate. Household spending continues to be strong, supported by a healthy job market, rising incomes, and solid consumer confidence. In contrast, business investment and exports remain weak, and manufacturing output has declined over the past year. Sluggish growth abroad and trade developments have been weighing on those sectors. Looking ahead, we continue to expect the economy to expand at a moderate rate, reflecting solid household spending and supportive financial conditions. The job market remains strong. The unemployment rate has been near half-century lows for a year and a half. The pace of job gains has eased this year, but has remained solid. We had expected some slowing after last year's strong pace. Participation in the labor force by people in their prime working years has been increasing, and wages have been rising, particularly for lower-paying jobs. People who live and work in low- and middle-income communities tell us that many who have struggled to find work are now getting opportunities to add new and better chapters to their lives. This underscores for us the importance of sustaining the expansion so that the strong job market reaches more of those left behind.